Hello and welcome. Here we go. Off and running with our first unit of the class. Birth of the Leviathan, 17th century European state building. What the hell does Leviathan mean? Actually means like big sea monster or creature. It does. What does it have to do with European state building? Well, first of all, it's the title of Thomas Hobbes' book, most famous book, which you'll see shortly, a work in political theory. But what does political theory of government have to do with a big giant sea monster? Hobbes was using Leviathan as a metaphor for big, kind of powerful, grasping government. So Leviathan, sometimes you hear this phrase today, the Leviathan state. It's usually not meant as a compliment. It's saying sort of the big, an abusive power of government to sort of get in the way of you or your life. So the birth of the Leviathan, the birth of big, powerful states. They're not traceable entirely to the 17th century in Europe. We could go back further, but I think this is as good a place as any, and it's really where you see most of the original developments of those aspects of the state that we're most used to today. Defining our terms, what do we mean by state? We mean by state, sort of, you could just substitute government or national government. This is the beginnings of what we today call countries. That's the common term. What country do you live in? What country is that? So Spain, or Japan, or whatever it may be, countries. And our globe is so much dominated by countries as sort of the governing units almost everywhere that it's testimony to the importance of these events we're seeing right here. The European states were, in many ways, the pioneers for this system, this type of governing system. And we'll see there are a number of variations of states or nation states, kind of the country model, even in the 17th century. But the French, the English, the Spanish, a few others that we'll talk about, kind of laid the groundwork for what became the dominant way to organize politically to govern large societies, nation states. So sometimes I say state, sometimes nation state, and to some that sounds redundant. Nation, state, I mean the same thing. The nation usually refers to the people that live there. The state usually refers to their government. So they're related. Nation, state, people, government. By building, we don't mean this building right here. We mean that they're building these states. And we're also talking about centralization of power, which we have plenty of slides to deal with as we go along. The palace that you see before you is the grand, extravagant palace at Versailles, possibly the grandest in all of Europe, and it was designed to be exactly that, built by Louis XIV. He's certainly on our menu in this unit, and we'll see more of Versailles later on. But if you ever go to France, it's just outside of Paris. Maybe some of you have been, but if you ever do go there, you must go to Versailles. It is spectacular. The broad lecture outline here divides things into 4 parts. First, the context. You should know already from our introductory lecture the importance of context in studying history. So we'll look at sort of what modern nation states or modern centralized nation states mean. We'll look at some of the political theory of the time. 3 major contributors there. Something called the Little Ice Age. We'll kind of put state building, nation state building into the larger global context. What's happening around it. Little Ice Age, the 30 Years' War. Of course, I'm leaving a lot out, but those are kind of the highlights or lowlights as they may be. In our sort of second section, we'll talk about more specifically centralized nation states in theory and in action. So what do you have to to qualify as centralized or to stay centralized? That's the theory part. And we'll look at a number of European nation states that were moving in this direction, not all of them successfully as states, nation states, or as even centralized nation states, but they're all, in a sense, trying for that, some more effective than others. The 2, I think, most outstanding examples of success in this area not necessarily meaning it's good for the people of the society, or at least everyone in the society, but are France, which is sort of usually seen as uh, the primary example of successful absolutism, royal absolutism, meaning the king was answerable to no one else, and certainly not answerable to a constitution or an elected legislature like a parliament. So royal absolutism took hold in France. We'll see sort of how and why. And the other successful model of centralization of a nation state is the path that England took to constitutional monarchy. That can be a little confusing because England, like France, its leaders, its kings, were trying to create royal absolutism, but in England they failed. And what they ended up with was a constitutional monarchy, which ended up being better for the people of England, but the kings weren't wild about it, at least not the ones that tried for absolutism and didn't make it. And we'll look at sort of how and why all of that shook out the way it did. Part 1, 2, 3, 4, in that order, of course. So the rise of 17th century European, here we say centralized states. I know I changed the terminology around a little bit, but it's sort of too much to put every word in each one of these slides. These, as I said before, are in many ways the foundations of almost all modern governments today, at least in sort of their most broad aspect and sort of broadest features. One way to kind of put these things into perspective is to sort of look at what came before, at least in Europe. Before, there were hereditary monarchies, city-states, empire states. That means there were challengers to nation states. So why did the nation state model come to basically wipe all these away? Since we know that almost everywhere today there are countries or states organized in roughly this fashion. The concept of cultural evolution, I think, is helpful here. Not all scholars like it, but I think it's useful in some places, in some respects. And that is to say that cultural evolution is not the same as biological evolution, Darwinian evolution, but it kind of mimics it in some ways. So what I think it is pretty safe to say is that the city-state, I'm sorry, the nation-state model, the one we're examining in this lecture, seemed to be better fit to survive. It seemed right to have sort of superior fitness, Darwinian terms, so it outcompeted the others and eventually kind of got rid of them all. It must have done something right in terms of right meaning success, not right or wrong, good or bad, uh, because it dominates today. So hereditary monarchies, nation states, or city states, pardon me, eventually kind of go by the wayside. Empires have survived here and there, but they're not as common as they once were, perhaps for the better. So hereditary monarchies meant, since there are hereditary monarchies, even in these nation states we'll be talking about, what this really means is that the earlier hereditary monarchies were not necessarily always sort of tied to particular specific boundaries, like France, as one, the people of France inside its borders and boundaries. Hereditary monarchies were political units governed by a king who inherited land, and with the land, the people, not always even of his own background or ethnicity or culture or language. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, is a good example of this. In the previous century, he was the king of Spain at the same time that he ruled over much of northern Italy, Germany, Belgium today, and on and on. How did he do that? Why did he do that? Why was he able to do that? Because of the hereditary patterns, legal European legal systems with response to with their way of passing down land and property from one generation to the next. So hereditary law is what these kings are sort of taking advantage of, or getting lucky and having fallen in their lap. Hereditary monarchies. So the point is that it wasn't necessarily about one piece of land all the time. Like the United States is always the same. Not that our country hasn't expanded through conquest, but other than that, it's pretty much the same. In Europe prior to the 17th century, it was pretty common for a king to at some point, inherit another kingdom in another place far away, not even connected by land to his original native country. And now he's the king of Spain and southern Italy and Belgium. So hereditary monarchies were actually a pretty common formulation, as weird as it sounds to us today. City-states are in some ways much like centralized nation states, but they're smaller scale. So in terms of usually smaller in population size and certainly smaller in terms of territory. Think of the city-states of ancient Greece, or even before that of ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerian city-states. And in our era here, we'll have course to talk about this some, but the Italian city-states, Florence, Venice, the Papal States, Naples, etc. So this is another type of political system or organizing principle which was around. The states is more complicated still, but it means government. Usually, it means government done by cooperating ecclesiastical authorities and officials, so church ruled regions. Not usually ruled by kind of one leader, but a number of, say, monasteries and a number of bishoprics sort of combined together and kind of become self-governing. So that's, I say, what was changing here, but part of what's changing is that there are fewer and fewer of those and more attempts, increasingly successful, at centralizing power under these larger nation states, larger in population size, again, geographical size. And we see kind of the first moves towards centralization. Again, we'll get back to it. I've said it 10 times now. Rationalization and bureaucratization, all of which are key fundamental pieces of what it means to sort of have a nation state or create a nation state. So centralization of power means when you sort of go from power being kind of spread out to it being sort of coming from one place, from many polities to kind of one polity, which often to make happen involves kings, leader, whatever title he takes, subduing outlying areas and saying, you're going to answer to me now. All these regions around here in this area are now answerable to me. And if they can pull that off, then they've centralized power. That's not the only way to centralize, but it's the most common in the era that we're talking about. Rationalization means that government becomes increasingly effective in terms of organization, in terms of being more and more systematic and more bureaucratized, so that it's less personal, but it's more efficient. Sort of an office structure or a corporate structure, a top-down structure like DMV or something, which is pretty boring, but it gets things done effectively. Another way to see the change that we're talking about here from what to what would be to say simply that in the nation states we talked about here, in empires and hereditary monarchies before before nation states started to centralize successfully, the loyalty was of the citizens, subjects, average people, was usually to the king, not just to the king as an office, a title. In this country, we're used to being loyal, say, to the president or the U.S. government, but not to the president as an individual. We're loyal to the office. Constitutionally, we're loyal to the office of president. In days prior to the 17th century, even into the 17th century, this is somewhat of a transition period in some ways. You were loyal to that particular king and his family. Many peasant, poor families would have a picture of the king, maybe the other members of the royal family, on their wall, framed. So they weren't just sort of loyal to the idea of the office of king, the institution of king. They were loyal to the actual person. But that starts to change right during this period and continues eventually until the personal loyalty part of it is gone or becomes extremely rare. We'll actually have, of course, to see a couple of exceptions, but most loyalty then eventually is moved to thinking of the government as something less personal. The state, the whole concept of the state, right? Nation state, talking about, is a much more impersonal concept. So bureaucracies, rationalized, a government more effective, efficient, systematic government is less personal. It's not too warm and fuzzy, but again, it gets more things done. At least, unless you were somebody that had a personal connection to the king. Of course, there are those. So we're going to look at 17th century political theory a little bit here, and look at three of its greatest practitioners, or most famous ones. This guy was a bishop in the French Catholic Church, and which meant that his own loyalties were sort of torn to some degree. The French kings, for a number of centuries, had expected the ultimate loyalty of their clergy to be to them first, and the Pope in Rome second. So all bishops and priests in France had sort of a difficult time. It wasn't ever easy to balance this out, to sort of figure out and know, believe, what part of their loyalty, what percentage belongs to the king of France, and what percentage belongs to the Pope, and to the Catholic Church centered in Rome. But he became the Bossuet, I shouldn't say his name, Bishop Bossuet, French bishop, but also intellectual, writing political theory here. Book published in 1709, so just after the end of this century. Politics drawn from the very words of Holy Scripture. The defender, as you see on the screen, of divine right theory. Not the only one, but the representative one that we'll use here. But he's particularly pertinent because he was specifically defending the rights of his king, Louis XIV, the French king, to rule by divine right. Divine right theory and divine right theorists argue that kings rule with God's permission, in a sense, that God wills them to be kings, and they're there because God wants them to. In a sense, God handpicked them to be king. And so, not something that we see much today, divine right theory, but it was the most commonplace way to justify or to defend why a particular king or royal family had the right to rule in this country or that kingdom. So it was the main one at the time, although its pedigree was not as old as some might think. Divine right theory does contradict some of the political theory coming out of the Middle Ages. We don't have time to talk about, really. It's a little bit newer than one might think, which also means it's a little more short-lived than people usually think, because right at this time that Bossuet and others are writing divine right theory, defending the principle that the king rules with God's will, God's blessing, it's starting to go out of fashion and style. He says in the book, Bossuet does, that God establishes kings as his ministers and reigns through them over the people. God establishes the kings and then reigns. God is sort of reigning through the hands and eyes and brain of the king and ruling over the people. The prince must be obeyed on principle as a matter of religion and of conscience. If he sins, he destroys the laws by his example, meaning the king, which is interesting because that little phrase right there is somewhat of an out clause, because it does say, at least there, that the king has some responsibilities, especially since he's sort of ruling for God. So the idea is he's supposed to do good. He's not supposed to sin. He's supposed to do good, particularly for the people, the subjects that he rules over. But as I said, defined right theory was on its way out by this time, and the two primary thinkers that really put it sort of out to pasture is this guy Thomas Hobbes and this guy John Locke. The latter being much more famous today in the U.S. Hobbes not as well known, and his theory or his political theory, Hobbes, uh, doesn't fit sort of the modern democratic sensibility nearly as much as Locke's does, although he's somewhat, I think, misunderstood. Leviathan, not his only book. This guy was a gifted philosopher and wrote more than just political theory, but that's what he's most famous for because Leviathan became one of the sort of great contributions to political theory. But he was extremely modern for the time, um, meaning for the time. The 17th century was the century of the scientific revolution, which is our next unit. And Hobbes was very well acquainted with modern science, I mean, again, modern at the time, and the scientific revolution, knew some of its great scientific thinkers, talked to them, and even his political theory shows that he himself was influenced by it. It's very rational, it's very empirical, meaning that the observations that Hobbes makes, the conclusions that he makes about what works in government and what doesn't, the best type of government is, come from observed facts and empirical evidence. Uh, not from God. He's modern in another way too here, and that is that there's no reference to God, no reference to divine right or anything about God in his political theory. That's not to say he didn't believe in God, though there are some questions about that by scholars about what he did believe with regard to religion or didn't believe. But it meant that he didn't use God in his political theory. He didn't believe that it was necessary. He didn't believe it was the way or the proper justification for the rule of any type of government. He in his political theory, he talks about deals with human nature. He deals with something known as this at the time as the state of nature. We'll see Locke also talked about this natural rights, the social contract. Some of the thinkers of this era, political thinkers, including Hobbes and Locke, are sometimes referred to as social contract theorists. All of them use the idea of the social contract. So let's unpack these terms a little bit. The state of nature to these thinkers meant what things were like for human beings way back when, thousands of years ago, before there ever was government, when people were just sort of living in a state of nature. No rules, no regulations, nobody telling them what to do, no cops, no judges, and no politicians passing laws and ordinances and this and that. What was life like? Well, they actually had no friggin' idea. They didn't, because the study of anthropology and archaeology wasn't even around yet. In fact, it wouldn't be for a long time. So what they were doing was kind of a thought experiment, and saying this is what we think it was probably like, thousands of years ago, and if it was like this, here would be the result, which is kind of overlaps with their thinking on human nature. Hobbes is famous for believing that human nature was rather nasty. From his most famous phrase from Leviathan, the life of man, nasty, brutish, and short. So he's quite pessimistic about human nature, which becomes, as you'll see, crucial to explaining his political theory, beliefs about government. That's to say that he believed that human beings couldn't be trusted. Natural rights is the idea that within nature, emanating from nature, there are certain rights that human beings possess that are already basically there. They're not based on power. They're not based on somebody. The right isn't based on somebody granting you the right. The right is already there. It already exists in nature. So these thinkers, 17th century political philosophers and thinkers, were also apt to talk about natural rights. Some of them believing in it, some of them less so, but all of them talking with it. The social contract, another feature that overlaps with the others here. The social contract, like the state of nature, was something that they didn't know anything about. But the social contract came about in theory or hypothetically when, after human beings sort of finally realized that we can do better than state of nature if we kind of organize a little bit more. That's going to require some rules. And so at some point, peoples in various places in the world enter into a social contract with each other and agree to set up a government and to entrust power to that government, whatever it is, however it's organized. And it's like a legally binding contract, a social contract. But they're not arguing about a specific contract ever signed or even talked about by anyone. They're saying it's as if. Once governments are formed or were formed, it's as if a social contract were signed, even though there is no actual contract. So much of this, again, is these guys are using Hobbes and Locke in particular, since those are the only two other than Bossuet who we're dealing with here, but they use these as sort of tools, conceptual tools to kind of set up their arguments and to make their arguments. So we know that Hobbes thought of human beings in a pessimistic way. He didn't have much faith in human nature, meaning he thought human beings were naturally, wicked, cruel, selfish, that they were likely to, if you have your back turned, steal from you, hit you over the head and steal other stuff. So he didn't have much faith in human beings, and particularly not in the state of nature, because there's no law in the state of nature. So you can put these together and sort of see where this is going. If human beings, if Hobbes was right, I'm not saying he is, but if he was right that human beings can't be trusted because they're selfish and wicked and cruel and nasty, then in the state of nature it would be just chaos all the time, violence, and there's nothing to stop it. There's nothing to rein it in. So his social contract has people sort of submitting to a social contract because they realize we can't sort of trust each other, and it's getting, it's been violent and crazy for a long time. We're better off organizing. But the governments that must form according to Hobbes, have to have a tremendous power, have to have authoritarian power. This is where we get back to the idea or the metaphor of Leviathan, this sort of big giant sea monster. He's saying, in essence, that human beings can't be trusted because they'll all kill each other, steal from each other, lie to each other, deceive each other. So the government has to sort of watch over them carefully, keep them under control, keep them kind of under surveillance because they can't be trusted. So because of his pessimistic view of human nature, I believe government has to be strong and tough and harsh if necessary, because that's better than the alternative, which he saw was as anarchy. That's what he believed anyway. So authoritarian government was, he believed, necessary. As ugly as that sounds to our ears in a democratic society today, of course it does, keep in mind he believed this was necessary, as it says, to protect a good individual and community life. So he wasn't just he wasn't just promoting authoritarianism for its own sake because he loved cruelty. He's saying, I believe it's the only way that we can have a civilization where people are not, they can sort of be inside their home reading a book or playing a game and not have to worry, too much about somebody busting in their door and, murdering them and taking all their stuff. There's no other way but tough, strong government. So his Leviathan state was not based on individual liberties and rights because he didn't believe people could be trusted with them. If you give them license, give them a rope, they will take gross advantage of it to someone else's, displeasure or someone else's demise even. John Locke, writing a little bit later, but also in the 17th century, was in many ways sort of you know making a counter argument. Uh, he also talked about the state of nature, as these guys were prone to doing in this era: human nature, natural rights, social contract. He thought human beings were born with natural rights. Famously, he said, to life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson, who was definitely influenced by John Locke's writings and work. All of our founding fathers in this country were aware of Locke's work and probably had all read Locke. So he's been very influential in our society. Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, changed the phrase to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, though property was still something very much, the right to property was still something very much that all of our founders believed in strongly. He had a much more, Locke had a much more optimistic view of human nature than Hobbes. He didn't think that life in the state of nature was bliss, otherwise he wouldn't have seen a need for government at all. But not surprisingly, with a, not as being as sort of dark in his view of human nature as was Hobbes, he didn't think as much government was necessary. He thought, well, we need enough to keep people in line, but we need no more than the minimum required to sort of keep law and order. And from there, we need to make sure that government doesn't overstep its bounds and stays under limits. And he was a promoter of constitutional government, really constitutional monarchy over absolute monarchy. Hobbes was in some ways talking about absolute monarchy, not the only type of authoritarian system at the time, but it's the one he knew about. Actually, he knew about two of them, two different types. But he certainly wasn't supporting constitutional government like Locke is here, because constitutional government, as we know in our country, because we have it here, is partly about rights and individual rights, right? And the rights that we have in this country, English, it's Locke saying the same thing. The English basically go the same direction as the U.S. does, right? I mean, the other way around, really. The British colonists who settled in on the eastern seaboard of the Atlantic coast and what's now the east coast of the U.S., of course, as Englishmen, brought their law and their ideas about government with them. So not surprisingly, this has an influence. But again, as I told you, our founders literally read the work of John Locke and were very influenced by it. But he believed that government then needed to be limited. He's sort of the kind of most important or the most well-known limited government theorist. Limited government is an idea that's still around today, and again has had a lot of influence on the way Americans, not just intellectuals, but average Americans, think about the proper function of government. So John Locke was saying, as far back as the late 18th or 17th century here, that government is necessary for there not to be anarchy. That much she had in common with Hobbes, but human beings aren't to be so little trusted that they need a government watching over them and controlling them and dominating them all the time, because if not, they'll step in line. For the most part, they can be trusted. So you just need government there, just the minimum amount necessary to secure people's life, liberty, and property. So this becomes incredibly influential in England, in the United States, or the colonies in the United States, and other places eventually as well. I want to zero in on one further thing here before moving on. Property. I think there's a misnomer about this. People misunderstand this. I hear often students and others talk about, well, Locke and others who, like our founding fathers, who were talking about the rights of property all the time. This is just a bunch of greedy rich guys trying to protect their money and keep it, from, spreading to anybody else. Well, there might be some truth to that, but keep in mind, property doesn't just mean your home. It means any personal possessions you have that are yours and not somebody else's. So the right to property is not just about sort of somebody that's greedy, wanting to make a lot of money or hoard all their money. It could be that too, but it's surely also about somebody just saying, you know what, the things that are mine are sacred to me, and you don't have a right to them. And even a home, a piece of property, an actual piece of property as a piece of land, right? Sometimes it is the one thing, the one place you can go is sort of a sanctuary, and it's saying nobody else has the right to come in and take your home, or come in and sort of tell you what to do in your own home. That's yours. That's kind of your safe space. So it's not just about greed, that for reasons of greed and money, that guys like Locke were so saying that property rights are so fundamental to any good society. It goes way beyond that. So the government has to be under law. It has to be kind of, to keep the government limited, there have to be lots of strictures on what government can do. Limited government and natural rights, right? Life, liberty, and property, which he believed came from nature, that it was evident that it came from nature. Locke talks about self-ownership, as you can see on the screen here. What does that mean? Well, human beings own themselves. Nobody else owns them, at least not by natural right. So slavery then violates natural rights because you don't own yourself. So he thought that you can sort of deduce certain things about government and about rights of people under government based on an appraisal of human nature. Nowadays, it's not as common, or actually it doesn't happen very much at all for people, professors or otherwise intellectuals, to adhere to a belief in natural rights. But I believe it is interesting. For instance, the human ability to reason, the human ability to will something, right? To have willpower, and willpower is kind of consistent with the idea of sort of achieving a goal, sticking to it, having perseverance and hard work to achieve the goal through a strong act of will. Reason and will, right, to seem to indicate that human beings were built to kind of do their own thing. They were built. Why would we need reason or willpower to just follow orders from everybody else all the time? So this is part of a natural rights argument about government as well. Like, no, human nature is constructed in a way. It's clear that human beings do better if they have less restraint, less constraints on their action and movement and thought and ability to do what they want, in life, barring, right, the few rules and laws that they need to adhere to and obey for civilization to continue to exist and everybody's rights to be respected. He also believed, and this might be the most important point of all, uh, that there was a right to revolution in certain circumstances. Not in all circumstances. He wasn't just saying anybody can legitimately rise up in revolution, but he did believe, unlike Hobbes, who believed that once people enter into a social contract, they can't get out of it. It's ironclad. Even if their government or leader is bad, he believed you're stuck with them. Why would he say that? Uh, Clearly, Hobbes believed that the danger of anarchy, having no government, was worse than the danger of having bad government, which is arguable, but that's what he believed. So the social contract was inviolable to him. To Locke, not so much. So to Locke, if the king, the government, whatever type of government it is, violates the social contract, right? It's as if they made an agreement, and the agreement clearly has something to do on the side of the government. You have to rule for the benefit of the people. So if you violate that part of the contract, the people have a right to reform the government or overthrow the government, which means revolution. So if it doesn't live up to its end of the bargain, its obligations, the people have a right to dissolve it or at least reform it, which also, of course, shows the influence of Locke on America and our founding fathers, the framers of our Constitution. The Declaration of Independence was basically making Locke's argument. This is why we have the legal and moral right to break away from Great Britain, the American colonists were saying, because the British government has violated the social contract. It has violated our own rights under natural rights, the concept of natural rights and natural law. Another similar concept. Natural rights, natural law go together quite well. So Bishop Bossuet, we could say, is defending absolute monarchy. We could say that divine right, absolute monarchy. Thomas Hobbes is defending any type of authoritarian system, including absolute monarchy, but something else, as long as it is a strong, powerful government. He's not thinking about individual rights so much. And Locke is, in many ways, the political philosopher of constitutional monarchy, believing that the government has to be under some strictures and some controls. So the Constitution, a Constitution whether written or done through precedent in legal cases or by statute in a legislature like a parliament, is limited in its power to sort of do whatever it wants. The whole concept of natural rights, civil liberties, life, liberty, property. Today we'd say freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. That's not just protecting your right to, say, speech from someone else who might want to take it from you. It's also about, and maybe was more about at the time, the government's having no right to deprive you of freedom of speech. So natural rights theory, constitutional government theory, limited government theory, all of these promoted by Locke are actually in many ways suspicious of government sort of being able to run roughshod over the individual. And so government is limited in a number of ways, but particularly in that sense, it's limited in what it can force the public to do. It can't violate someone's individual rights. To go on with more context, not just political theory, but kind of looking at what life was like in the 17th century in Europe, we get to the Little Ice Age and the 17th century crisis. This is actually a global crisis, not just a European one, but again, this is Western Civ, European history, so we'll stick with this part of it. But what do they mean by Little Ice Age? This was a climate change event. Throughout much of the 17th century, particularly the first half, there was a serious cooling of the Earth's climate, which lasted for, again, decades and decades. And it changed everything in Europe and globally. This painting by Hendrik Averkamp from this century is about this. I don't have time to go into it really, but it's a fascinating painting because you can see all kinds of abnormal things happening here in the painting if you look close enough. At first glance, it looks like just kind of this peaceful scene of people kind of on ice skating in a winter village, but it's a bit more disturbing than that. And so a lot of the artwork of the 17th century, in one way or another, attests to the many types of crisis that come about because of the cooling trend of the period. In a book about this crisis, a very recent one called Nature's Mutiny by Philip Blom, a great author and intellectual, his most recent book here, he says, a succession of brutal and extreme weather events, severe storms, weeks of rain, and even years of summer drought, as well as unrelenting frosts, were kind of the results on the Earth of this crisis, this cooling period. He goes on to say the agricultural crisis caused by the Little Ice Age served as a catalyst for change everywhere. facilitating some ideas and practices, social, cultural, and political, while making others impossible. In fact, his whole book here, Nature's Mutiny, is about how much the Little Ice Age helps to explain, or had a hand in sort of explaining wars and political developments, cultural developments, economic developments, on and on throughout the 17th century. That it's the climate and its sort of drastic change to the cold had a tremendous impact on kind of all aspects of life and society. If that wasn't tough enough to get through, then comes the 30 Years' War. This was kind of the world war of the 17th century, though it was, here in Europe only. Not, I mean, we're not in Europe, but I'm talking about Europe, so it's as if we're here. But about 6 million killed in 30 years. So this made it a very bloody war. As Professor Perry, our lovable textbook author, says, the 30 Years' War saw the Austrian branch of the Catholic Habsburg family, more on them later, join forces with their Spanish cousins, and neither the Protestant Swedes and Germans nor the Dutch could stop them. Only French participation in the war on the Protestant side tipped the balance decisively against the Habsburgs. In the course of the war, large portions of what is now Germany were destroyed, and its population fled or was killed, about 6 million. At the tail end of it came the peace treaty, officially ending the war, the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, one of the most influential treaties in European history. It basically established the concept of balance of power, which we won't explain now, but we'll certainly come back to it on numerous occasions. It became the balance of power thinking, became the way European leaders thought about relations between the European countries, foreign policy. There was a religious settlement aspect to the Treaty of Westphalia. There had been, up until this time, about a century and a half of religious warfare between Catholics and Protestants, all fallout from the Protestant Reformation, and this is sort of the last big war that was at least partly about religion. The 30 Years' War wasn't just a war between Catholics and Protestants. It was partly that. It also was about political rivalry, military rivalry, dynastic conflict and problems. But it was partly religion. So we'll have occasion to see why it was that France was the only country that participated in the war that didn't fight on either the Catholic or the Protestant side, fought on the wrong side. France was an officially Catholic country, and yet it fought on the Protestant side in the war, which actually was a major development kind of in political theory in its own right. Centralization of political power itself, we're going to get into this in the next segment, and then look at some of the specific countries centralizing rather quickly before we get into our sort of deep dive into centralization of power in absolutist France, constitutional England.